This video is about prokaryotes. And prokaryotes are cells that do not have nuclei. You already know enough to answer this MCAS question, just based on the title of this video. Prokaryotes are cells that do not have a nucleus. The illustration below shows the external features of a prokaryotic organism. Which of the following can be concluded about the internal cellular contents of this prokaryote? A, the cell does not contain ribosomes. B, the cell does not contain a nucleus. C, the cell contains mitochondria. Or D, the cell contains a vacuole. We know that the cell is prokaryotic, and if we know that it's prokaryotic, we know that it does not contain a nucleus. All cells are either prokaryotic or eukaryotic. Prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus, whereas eukaryotic cells do have a nucleus. And all a nucleus is a membrane that surrounds the cell's DNA. So if you look at these two images, they're identical images except for the purple oval in the image on the right. That represents the nucleus. You see how it's surrounding the DNA. If these words are new to you, this might not be obvious, though it's very obvious once you're familiar with these terms. A prokaryote is a prokaryotic organism. Those words look similar, prokaryote and prokaryotic, because they refer to the same thing. And a eukaryote is a eukaryotic organism. Some organisms are very simple. For instance, bacteria consists of just one cell. Their DNA consists of one chromosome, and their lifespan is measured in minutes. Such organisms have no need for a protective membrane around their DNA. They're not going to live for very long, and they don't have that much DNA. They're going to grow, copy their DNA, and then divide, and their life's over in that maybe 20 minutes. So there's no need for a protective membrane around the DNA of such simple organisms. They don't need a nucleus. On the other hand, some organisms are highly complex. For instance, human beings are made of many different kinds of cells. We have tissues. We have tissues that are organized into organs, and then those organs work together in an organ system. And so we're very complex. And to be this complex requires much more DNA than is required by a bacterium. In fact, we have 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs of chromosomes. Complex organisms store their DNA in a nucleus, and a nucleus is a membrane that surrounds the DNA of a cell, and it protects the DNA. In this image, the purple oval surrounding the red DNA, that's the nucleus. And it makes sense if you think about it. Complex organisms are going to have a lot of DNA, and they're going to live for more than 20 minutes. So it makes sense that they would want to protect that DNA. And by the way, one nucleus, many nuclei. Nucleus and nuclei, they're the same word. It's just that nucleus refers to one. Nuclei refers to many. Let's take a look at the prokaryotes. Prokaryotes are organisms whose cells do not contain nuclei. What we're looking at is an image of a bacterium, a typical prokaryote. And if you look at its DNA is not surrounded by a membrane. Now, of course, I'll point out, yeah, the entire cell is surrounded by the plasma membrane, the cell membrane, the phospholipid bilayer, we could call it any of those things. But the DNA itself does not have its own membrane. That's what we mean when we say it doesn't have a nucleus. It's simply floating in the cytoplasm. And the cytoplasm is represented as green, so I've highlighted the word in green. The DNA is simply floating in the cytoplasm. It doesn't have its own protective membrane. That's what we mean when we say prokaryotes do not have a nucleus. All prokaryotes are unicellular, meaning that they're made of just one cell. And prokaryotes do not have membrane-bound organelles. Just as the DNA is simply floating in the cytoplasm without its own protective membrane. This is true of any other structure within a prokaryote. For instance, the ribosomes. Ribosomes do not have a membrane surrounding them. They simply float in the cytoplasm. Prokaryotes almost always have cell walls. A very small number of prokaryotes don't have cell walls, but the vast majority do. In the image on the left, the cell wall is represented in brown. So the cell membrane is represented in black, and then outside of the membrane, surrounding the membrane, is a cell wall. The cell wall is going to be harder, stiffer, and it's going to offer protection to the cell. We see a cell wall on the right as well. It's represented in yellow. So in that image, don't get too distracted by the other components here. What you're interested in is that gray cell membrane, and then surrounding that is the yellow cell wall. So just know that most prokaryotes, almost all prokaryotes, have cell walls, and the cell wall is located outside the cell membrane. It just offers protection and structure for the cell. Many prokaryotes have a flagellum. A flagellum is a tail-like structure used for movement. In this image, this is the flagellum, and the flagellum is very clearly labeled in this image as well. Not all prokaryotes have flagella, but images of prokaryotes will often portray them as having flagella because they are very common among prokaryotes. Biologists divide up living things into 6 kingdoms, and all prokaryotes are found in just 2 of these kingdoms. And these kingdoms are Eubacteria and Archaebacteria. Eubacteria and Archaebacteria. Now, Eubacteria and Archaebacteria are 2 different kingdoms. There are differences between Eubacteria and Archaebacteria. And the word bacteria only refers to Eubacteria technically. But the truth is anything that we say about bacteria or Eubacteria in this class is also going to apply to Archaebacteria. We're not that concerned with the differences. So when we talk about bacteria in this class, whatever we say will also apply to Archaebacteria. But the point is that all prokaryotes belong to one of these 2 kingdoms, Eubacteria or Archaebacteria. Prokaryotes reproduce through binary fission. Virtually all prokaryotes reproduce through binary fission. A handful of exceptions, but they're not important for our purposes. Binary fission involves copying the DNA and then splitting in half. So that's what's happening in the cell. The red represents the DNA, and one copy is moving to the left, one copy is moving to the right, and the cell is being pinched in the middle so that it can divide into 2 separate cells. And those separate cells are going to be identical to each other, and they will be identical to the parent cell, the original cell that divided in half. And that's binary fission, and that's how prokaryotes reproduce. Prokaryotes are the simplest living things. There's nothing smaller nor simpler than a prokaryote that is alive. We'll talk about viruses at a different point in the class. Viruses are much smaller than prokaryotes. Viruses are tiny. They're submicroscopic. But viruses are not considered alive. They can't carry out the functions of life on their own. Prokaryotes can. A single prokaryote is a living thing on its own. And so prokaryotes are the simplest living things. I'm reiterating that because it's a theme on the MCAS. And the fact that this makes them very useful in scientific research is also a theme I've noticed on the MCAS. So know that prokaryotes are very simple, and know that this is one of the reasons that scientists like using them for research. If you were to try and study the lifespan of a human being, that would take decades and decades and decades. And at the end of that lifespan, the end of those decades, you will have studied one person. Remember, bacteria might live for 20 minutes, half an hour, something like that. So you can study many, many lifespans of bacteria in a few hours. And so this makes them very useful in research. There are many reasons why they're useful, but this is one of them. This video is about prokaryotes. Prokaryotes are organisms whose cell does not contain a nucleus. Prokaryotes also do not have membrane-bound organelles. And all prokaryotes are unicellular. The vast majority of prokaryotes have cell walls, and many of them have a flagellum. All prokaryotes belong to either the kingdom Eubacteria or the kingdom Archaebacteria. And prokaryotes, almost all of them, reproduce through binary fission. And because of their simple cellular structure and their short lifespans, prokaryotes are frequently used in research. Let's look at some MCAS questions about prokaryotes. Which of the following organisms has the simplest cellular structure? A, bacterium, B, earthworm, C, mushroom, D, sunflower. Well, a bacterium is a prokaryote, and we said that the simplest living things are prokaryotes, so the answer is A. And maybe the most interesting thing about this question is that these other organisms, they're probably things that you don't think of as complex or complicated. Earthworms, mushrooms, sunflowers, but compared to bacteria, these are very complex organisms. A scientist is studying gene expression in a prokaryote. Which of the following organisms could the scientist be studying? I'm not going to read the species names, I'll just read the organism. A bacterium, B, a moss, C, a fungus, or D, a roundworm? Well, you know that bacteria are prokaryotes, and so that's your answer, A. A moss, a fungus, a roundworm, all of those organisms are eukaryotic. The cells of those organisms contain nuclei, but that's not true of bacteria. The bacterium E. coli is a model organism used by many scientists for genetic and biochemical research. Which of the following statements helps explain why E. coli is so frequently used for research? A, it has a large nucleus and a long generation time. Well, A is definitely not correct. E. coli, we're told in the question, is a bacterium. Bacteria are prokaryotes, and by definition, prokaryotes do not have nuclei. So we know that E. coli does not have a nucleus, and generation time refers to how frequently an organism reproduces. E. coli is not going to have a long generation time. It's not even going to have a long lifespan. It's going to have to reproduce quickly. So A is not correct. B, it has hundreds of chromosomes and a long lifespan. Again, E. coli is a bacterium. Bacteria are prokaryotes. And prokaryotes do not have a lot of DNA. They only have a little bit of DNA. So they're not going to have hundreds of chromosomes. And they're going to have a short lifespan, not a long lifespan. So A and B are very wrong. C, it has a simple structure, a simple cell structure, and reproduces rapidly. Well, C is our answer. Prokaryotes are the simplest living things. So E. coli is going to have a simple cell structure. And prokaryotes also have short lifespans, and they're going to need to reproduce rapidly. In fact, their lifespan ends with their reproduction because they reproduce through binary fission, which is one of the reasons D is incorrect.